Political upheaval in Armenia as the Prime Minister, who was president, is forced to step down. Tens of thousands of anti-government protesters marched for days to demand his resignation. So, what's next? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Nearly 2 weeks of political drama in Armenia have ended with the downfall of the Prime Minister who was president. Serge Sargisyan abruptly resigned just a few days after being appointed by Parliament. He became Prime Minister after ending 10 years in power as president. Protesters accused him of a political power grab and marched on the streets of the capital Yerevan for days. As news of his resignation spread, protesters cheered. Opposition leader Nikol Pashinyan, who was detained and later released, said power is with the people. In his resignation letter, Mr. Serge Sargisyan said, Nikol Pashinyan was right, I was wrong. The created situation has some solutions, but I will not go to any of them. That's not mine. I leave the post of the country's Prime Minister. The movement of the street is against my office. I fulfill your claim. Well, let's bring in our guests. From Yerevan, Salpi, Ghazarian, director of the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies. From Berlin is Armenian Kanjian, an activist from Armenia who was detained in the last protests while taking photos. And from Tbilisi, Georgia, is Georgia, Human Rights Watch South Caucasus Director in the Europe and Central Asia Division. Very good to see all three of you. Armenian Kanjian, I should imagine that this is a good moment for you.
Yes, Jane, this is a miraculous, beautiful, miraculous little moment. I say little as a metaphor because it's gigantic what has happened today. This is what the people of Armenia were hoping for, and for in a final effort to come to the streets in such big numbers, they could make their voices be heard loud and clear enough that the country needs change, and that the government and the state are there to serve them, and that they have to really now take the steps that they have voted for in the change from presidential to parliamentary system, and therefore now it starts to be time for people's voices to be heard. I just want to say one thing, Jane, is that I am an Armenian, but I'm not from Armenia. I am a diasporan Armenian and I live in Canada. I happen to be in Berlin for my professional work. So, but this makes no difference because the resignation of Serge Sargisyan is a relief for the entire nation.
I should imagine as an activist this must be deeply satisfying, and the diaspora, as you say, spread across the world.
Well, it is incredibly joyful moment because the diaspora has been, in a way, as much in a straitjacket as the people in Armenia, always being threatened by rhetoric that was to be quiet. Otherwise, we would be in turmoil. We are a small country. We cannot afford upheaval. But this is not true. This country was on the brink of being imploding within itself. So we were threatened by explosions coming from outside. But I think the biggest threat was that for a third term as a prime minister or otherwise, Serge Sargisyan wanted to keep his grip on the people, but he is not desired by the new young generations. He is not desired by the old generations, by the children, women and men, and everyone in the diaspora who now understands that we also have a voice, even if we're not citizens of the country, but we have an obligation and a responsibility to be attentive to what's going on in our homeland.
But let's go to the thick of it, the heart of the demonstrations, to Yerevan, and bring in Salpi. Ghazarian, what is your response to what happened?
You know, Jane, Armenia has been on the streets here, and Georgi, who has seen revolutions in neighboring Georgia, know very well that what we have here is absolutely a joyful situation, but equally, we have a great deal of expectations, even some anxiety to deal with. I'm also the director of CivilNet, which is a youth-run online television channel. And these kids, they'll forgive me, have been out in the streets 24 hours a day over the last 2 weeks. And as thrilled as they are with the fact that the people's demands were met, they also recognize that we have a long road to cross. We have institutions to build. We really need to learn how to translate politics into policy. These are things we really haven't learned very well over the last 30 years. And so, as happy as everyone is, the challenge is before us, and it's ours to mess up. It's a wonderful opportunity for now a new generation who sees the revolution. The ones who saw the revolution, which is really what it was in 1988 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were quite disenchanted. Now they are up very pleased at what is really a second opportunity, as is the younger generation. And now we've got the hard work to do.
Yeah, they've got to make good on it, don't they? Georgi Gogia, before we get down to what actually happened, why he stepped down, what led him to do that, tell me about your response and what sort of impact you saw these protests having on people, their safety as well.
Thank you, Jane. Let me start by congratulating people of Armenia. I think it's really incredible moment, and this is something that is really time to enjoy it. But as Salpi has mentioned, there's a lot ahead. I also am glad that Salpi had mentioned the role that journalists have played. I mean, last 11 days have not been easy, and I think journalists have been above and beyond, and they've been really in the forefront of covering 24-hour regime, the developments, and have been great support to the public at large. I think, yesterday, I have to admit that yesterday when the talks have failed and now resigned Prime Minister have mentioned an event of 10 years ago, March 1, 2008, my heart sank because I was there then, and Human Rights Watch has documented the excessive use of force by law enforcement that resulted in dozens and dozens of injuries and 8 people and 8 protesters and 2 law enforcement dead. So this could have gone wrong in so many ways.
And sorry, can I just jump in here? Are you referring to the interview? The interview between the Prime Minister and the opposition leader when the Prime Minister stood up after a matter of minutes and left? I should imagine that must have been such a concern because it could have gone anyway.
Exactly. I mean, exactly. It could. This was in the very short talk that between Prime Minister and opposition leader Nikol Pashinyan, and Prime Minister has mentioned that, have you not learned the lesson from March 1? And my heart sank because it was really it's a very bad reminder of how things could have gone wrong in so many ways. And it has in the past, including, it started in 2008, but including, in 2016, when again, law enforcement have used excessive force, stun grenades, have beaten non-violent, peaceful demonstrators in the streets and detained scores of people, imposing excessive charges against them, and some of the trials are still ongoing from even 2016. So, this could have gone anyway, imaginable, and in many ways wrong. So I'm really glad to see that at least the reason has won at this time, and the Prime Minister has resigned, listening to the voices of the public. However, there is a really long way to go, and as you know, Prime Minister was appointed by the ruling party, and the ruling party has the majority in the parliament, and they will be. The ruling party will be in power to appoint the new prime minister, and this goes back to the kind of lack of legitimacy of the current leadership in Armenia because of many years of manipulation of elections. International observers, just last year when Parliament was elected, international observers had spoken and have documented vote buying, vote manipulation, pressure on the voters. So it is not just a message to the now resigned prime minister, but the ruling party, who has to now understand that what public wants and make sure that the grievances
bring in
and very
Arseny
legitimate
here.
grievances that public had against
Georgi, let's bring in Arseny.
Has a big
Go
responsibility
for it,
at this point to be, yes?
Go ahead, Arseny.
The ruling party is not alone. It has its collaborators, its co-workers, or another party, which is the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. And I think this is an incredible moment for the political parties to really come together and see how they will deal with the new institutional changes that are, yes, a long way that we're going to have to follow, because Armenia has not had that opportunity to find those institutional structures that are going to serve the people. But I have to say that with the mobilization that we did in between 2016 and 2017 for the elections towards a presidential presidential system into a parliamentary system, that mobilization was fraudulent. But we did have outside observers to come and actually see outside observers, meaning from the diaspora, and I think the new parliament was constructed around fraudulent, in a way, system. But I think the long way that we're referring to now is for a change, to understand that these parties, even if they are represented in big numbers or they are in coalition, that they have the responsibility to start working in a transparent and communicative way with the people.
Okay, let me bring Serpi in here, if I may. I mean,
where they undertake a different kind of approach.
Salpi, this is a challenge, isn't it? Considering that Parliament did say that it was okay for him to become Prime Minister. So clearly there are supporters there who wanted him to continue in this role for whatever reasons, however they benefited from him being in that role. So there's a lot you've got to undo, don't you, before you move forward?
Actually, that's all true. However, we do have a constitution, and the provisions of the constitution are very clear. It's absolutely possible to call new elections. And once new elections are called, this is where the continuation of the civic activism and the awareness that this population has demonstrated over these last 2 weeks is going to be called up. Are we serious about clean, new, transparent elections? Will the parliament that convenes again in a few days understand the message of the people, regardless of what party they belong to, and understand that the methods of operation have got to change? There are many people there with vested interests. Will they stay? Will they leave? Will the people want them to stay? The continuation of what Georgi was referring to a little while ago in terms of the fact that this could have gone anyway is partly because the protesters and the protest leaders were as adamant about teaching as they were about protesting. They were consistently calling for civil disobedience. They were explaining why this protest needs to be decentralized and variegated in its geography, in its composition. And that same sort of awareness and civic activism is going to have to continue. It's not about one man. This guy's gone. What happens next?
And tell me, before we get to what happens next, how did this happen? I mean, we were supposed to have his spokesperson, the Prime Minister's spokesperson, on our show. He didn't know until just before we started recording that this was going to happen. So it seemed to be a bit of a surprise all round. Any idea what forces worked on him to resign?
The people. The numbers of people on the streets and the intensity of their both demands and their physical presence, the passion that they've demonstrated, the continuing flow of support from the diaspora. This was not an organized top-down protest. This was as bottom-up a revolt as there could be. There were gatherings and protests in the city centers of all of the cities and in villages. People walked from the neighboring cities into Yerevan to protest. This was widespread, and the only way to have stopped it would really have been to resort to force. And as Georgi said, we're thankful he did.
Okay, let me bring Georgi in.
Serge Sargisyan, he had made a promise that the people realized that it was not being held. He was not holding on to his promise when the referendum happened, and there were enough cynicism around to believe that the change of the constitution from presidential to parliamentary is going to secure a more transparent and open and inclusive environment. Serge Sargisyan had made a promise, a pledge that he will not run for the prime minister's office. And I think people believed, as they have believed in the last years of independence, often in a goodwill that change will happen. And we have seen, and they have seen specifically, that there were always lies following these promises. And I think this time people could not any further be taken for incompetent civilians.
Okay.
And I think that question that you're asking, Jane, is pertaining to a movement that is a grassroots movement, as Salpi said, absolutely. But the grassroots realize that now the lie is too big when the prime minister is becoming the ex-president of the country, who has already made a very clear declaration that he will not run for office.
Georgi, why do you think he wanted to make that move in the first place? I mean, was he looking at the region and he thought, well, it worked for Putin, it worked for Erdogan, so it could work for me? I mean, what was he thinking?
Well, this was a clearly attempt to stay in power longer than constitutionally was initially prescribed. I mean, I agree. I mean, in 2014, when there was a constitutional changes in Armenia and moving from presidential to parliamentary republic, I mean, he made a very clear promise that this was not done for him to come in power. Unfortunately, he broke this promise, and we've seen last week him being appointed as the prime minister. And until very last moment, he was not really openly saying that he was going to break his promise, although it was becoming apparent. Furthermore, I think what is clear here is that this is not just about one person stepping down. I mean, there are very real grievances accumulated in public. It is very important for the ruling party to listen to what public really wants. And it's a very important step forward. We can all now speculate whether it will be new elections. It's one thing for the prime minister to let the power go, to relinquish its power, but another thing is the ruling party prepared to do the same. I think when I mentioned the democratic legitimacy of the power, it is really a problem, and there was this vacuum because of the falsified, because of the vote buying, because of the pressure that was happening on electorate in the past few elections in Armenia. So it is important now. How do they overcome this? I mean, Armenian public and the government has to decide what would be the next step. Would be the new elections? Would be appointing the prime minister that will be acceptable for the larger public? Because right now, let's face it, I mean, still Republican Party and the coalition members do have the parliamentary majority that would enable them to appoint a new prime minister. So it's not about who the prime minister is, again, I repeat myself, but it's about what are the grievances, and these are very real grievances that, there are rampant corruption in the country, there is extreme poverty, there are oligarchic rules that need to be broken down.
The country is emptying itself from its own citizens. I mean, we are really thankful that we had this movement coming from the youth and of all generations. But the country's biggest challenge right now, beyond the economic, is the fact that people are leaving the country. And a country that has no population doesn't have any reason to be called a country. So we also have political prisoners that are right now because of freedom of speech or because of what Nikol Pashinyan undertook in the past when they have tried to be creating those movements. Under the 2 mandates of presidency of Serge Sargisyan, the police violence and the lack of opportunity for people to express their will and their voice has been so strong that beyond the symbolic, I think the practical elements are the 2 major issues of Armenia, which is depopulation and political prisoners. And I think any new reform that is going to take place through parliamentary voice is going to have to address also this, because economically the country can put itself back into a good system if the oligarchic monopolization of the riches of the country goes beyond the hands of those people who are non-elected, illegitimate people who are representing the major Republican Party, and the oligarchic system itself is being challenged.
Okay.
But I think by the resignation of Serge Sargisyan, they understood one thing, that if it's one person, now it's going to be spread to the entire government that represents the mentality of Serge Sargisyan, or the kind of governance that Sargisyan overlooked. So,
okay. Salpi, sorry, let me just broaden this out a little bit more, if I may, with Salpi. What do you think regionally will happen now? I mean, how is Russia, for example, viewing what's going on here? A close ally. We know that Armenia tried to limp its way towards the EU. That didn't work. So how will the geopolitics play out now?
So that's exactly the question, and it adds to what Arsen has said. Yes, there are demographic issues. Yes, there are political prisons, but there are serious regional challenges. There are issues of economic development, which at the end of the day are the issues that will help resolve all of the other problems. And, you know, it's very hard to imagine a set of institutions that have modified themselves to become instruments of holding on to power rather than actually doing what they do. That includes the institutions of higher education. It includes the media. It includes the customs service. This is really deep. And of course, it includes all of the regional relations. At the end of the day, Armenia's choices, given the geographic and geopolitical situation, Armenia's choices are limited. Armenia cannot and will not choose between Russia and the West. And Armenia can and has in the past managed to maintain that balance. I think that at the end of the day, if Armenia manages to govern itself in the way in which it wants, Russia will not be the obstacle, certainly, to that. The challenge really is ours, and of course, it's to create a democratically legitimate government that can, in fact, negotiate a peace with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. There's no going back to 1988. We need to go forward. And that those regional relationships affect our relationship with Georgia. They certainly affect our relationship with Turkey, and to some extent with Iran. And so this new process of building institutions, political, economic, educational, social, they have to go deep. The public has to trust its leadership in order to trust a peace deal. And Russia is part of that formula, but certainly not the deciding factor. The decisions are made here. We just,
both internally and regionally. Interesting time for Armenia. Will it be able to do it?
This is a dramatic change. I mean, there are a lot of expectations in the public, in the streets. So it's very, very important that government really hears the grievances that are accumulated in the public and respond to them. Institutions are not going to be built overnight, but it is very important to start it and start it the right way. I won't be able to comment on the regional thing. I can talk about the human rights challenges of Armenia, including the lack of independence of judiciary, including the ongoing trials, including the including the excessive use of force by law enforcement. There are many human rights challenges that Armenia has. So it's very important the public has spoken. It's very important that, you know, for public to celebrate what they have achieved so far, but it's not over. It's important to methodically, step by step, make the change and build the institutions that are so much lacking right now in Armenia. One of the reasons that people have been leaving the country, one of the reasons for depopulation is actually the disillusionment that people had with the justice system, because they were not finding it. They were not finding justice in Armenia, and they were choosing to live or abroad. So it's important to restore people's faith in institutions, restore people's faith in justice. And
let's leave it on those wise words from Georgi, Gorgia, Arseny Kanjian, and Salpi Ghazarian. Thank you very much. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again if you wish, anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Mine is @Jane Dutton. And from me, Jane, the rest of the team, goodbye.